We're excited to introduce our speaker today. So we have with us Hayley Pierce. She is a tenure-track associate professor here at BYU in the College of Family, Home, and Social Sciences. She began in 2018 as assistant professor, teaching a variety of sociology courses. Prior to this, she obtained her undergraduate education in sociology with minors in international development and nonprofit management. She then completed her Master of Science in Sociology at BYU with a thesis focused on millennial development goals and child well-being. Dr. Pierce went on to obtain her PhD in demography at the University of California, Berkeley, with a dissertation concentrated on child well-being, reproductive health, and maternal health for Palestinian refugees in Jordan. Her impressive education becomes even more so with the fact she is a first-generation college student. She credits some of her success to mentors who helped her see her potential along the way. Outside of academic pursuits, she enjoys mentoring other students herself and supporting a variety of committees, including the Global Women's Studies Executive Committee. Last summer, she directed the GWS Study Abroad on Human Rights and Women's Rights across Western Europe and traveled with her husband John and two sons, James and Miles. We're excited to hear from Dr. Hayley Pierce on her research surrounding women's well-being through her presentation titled Witches, Victims, and Villains, #MeToo and the Political Polarization of Sexual Violence. We thank her again for being with us today. Please welcome Dr. Hayley Pierce with a round of applause.
Thank you so much. Before I get started, I recently had the honor of reading a poem by a fantastic poet who also happens to be a friend. And I asked her, because of its appropriateness for the content and just how beautiful the poem is, I asked her to read it here today. So she's going to do that, and then we'll dive in. Maybe.
All of them witches. Who cares if you float or sink in Lake Constance? Everyone knows you're a witch. Conjure milk from the handle of an axe. Grow plots rich with slippery elm and nettle. Charm the neighbor's ox to speech. Listen. It was mother who first clotted cream with a glance, who, in smothering dreams, still warns against corners and all their gibbering shadows. Don't sit like an abscessed tooth. Life pearls. Like common knotweed, resist. Look. Flying ahead, a blue warbler. In popular media, witches materialize, green-faced, with pointy hats and bubbling cauldrons. In the imagination of early Christians, witches beguiled, tormented, and made pacts with the devil. In reality, witches manifested as society's darkest and most misogynistic fears. Men so feared witches, they burned, drowned, and hanged them. The impetus for this poem came while I researched witch crazes of early modern Europe and New England. As I read court documents, I imagined a woman awaiting trial and the impossibility of her circumstance. Men in power often subjected accused witches to nonsensical tests to prove their innocence, one of which originated as a Germanic rite known as the swimming test. If the accused sank and drowned, she was innocent. If she floated or swam, she was put to death. Either way, she was dead or damned. Long after the last witch hunt, violence against women endures. In the face of Me Too, detractors have ironically recycled the term witch hunt to intimidate and silence survivors. This poem speaks to the spirit of perseverance and celebration of survival, either literally or figuratively. To survive is magical, and to those who would do harm, perhaps even diabolical.
Thank you, Erin. That's just a precursor of what's to come, and I should have ended with that because that's kind of the high note. As is kind of inherent in the title, this is a very tender topic. We are covering things like politics, sexual violence, polarization, and all things really complicated, emotional, sensitive. And so I'm going to treat it with that sensitivity. However, I am using Twitter data, and as those who created these tweets, they are not treating it with that same sensitivity. And so some of the tweets are hard to read, and we'll get there, but please kind of know what's coming. 1 in 5 women and 1 in 14 men will experience rape or attempted rape in their lifetime. This is one estimate of many that you can see, and the numbers range because of the sensitive nature of the topic and how complicated it is to really understand these numbers. I really want to point out from the beginning that these numbers are irrespective of political party. All people are subject to these experiences regardless of their politics. So the political nature of sexual violence should be a little bit problematic, right? However, we know that sexual assault and politics have been historically intertwined, and it is no different today. There are different laws surrounding sexual assault that highlight the political and legal nature of the issue. One way we can see this is that the legal definition of rape has repeatedly changed. It really began as a property crime, seeing the woman as property of her father, and then that would transition maybe to property of her husband. Regardless, she was considered property and was then damaged property following any type of sexual assault. Just recently, in the last 50 years, we've seen an addition of criminalization of marital rape and of kind of removing the obligation or opportunity for witnesses or those who are on trial kind of for sexual assault on the other end, right? Accusing those of sexual assault of not being able to kind of attack their character while they are on trial. They are not on trial. I'm not wording that correctly. You know what I mean. The laws have changed over time, which is showing that it is a legal matter, right? It is a legal issue to be discussed. That alone will keep sexual assault within this legal kind of context. In the U.S. as well, sexual assault has become highly intertwined with women's rights and issues more broadly, which are already political and polarized, with a lot of political leanings on what women should and shouldn't be able to do and how politics comes into play there. This is the briefest of kind of explanation for the political history of sexual violence. I can't dive into it too much here just for the sake of time, but it does suggest that the history or the progress of Me Too, that the sexual violence was also going to become politicized. Me Too and sexual violence could not escape kind of the political history that sexual violence had experienced in the past. So that's what we were then understanding, because we knew Me Too would become political, just as sexual violence is political. So we wanted to understand how language and rhetoric were utilized on a social media platform to aid in this polarization process, because it has implications for sexual violence broadly, but also for social movements broadly, how they function and how they manifest on a political or social media platform. I want to tell you a little bit about the Me Too movement that happened prior to this more kind of recent tweet-originated movement. Tarana Burke started Me Too in 2006. Her focus was to help survivors, specifically Black women and girls from low-income communities, to receive help and resources for sexual violence. One of their big kind of tenets is that they promote empowerment, which happens when we lead with empathy. And I want to read a little bit from her book, which tells about kind of the origination of the Me Too movement. This first quote comes after she was a counselor in a camp. And one of her she kind of explained them as just a hard youth, right? Someone that she really put under her wing, tried really hard to get to know. This youth came to her and told her about her experience with sexual violence. Tarana Burke had had a lot of experiences with sexual violence and assault as well. And she says herself that she had not grappled with it. And she was a bit confused by the student's ability to just talk about what happened. And so Tarana says that she kind of sent her away. She sent her to a counselor, right? Not to get resources, but she just said, I'm not ready to be the one that you're talking to. So here's kind of her digesting that. It wasn't the details of what she experienced that most resonated with me. It was the feeling it left with her. The confusion, the questions, the anger, and the sadness. It was the need for a way out or a way forward. There was only one thing I was compelled to share the whole time she was talking, and it was like someone else was whispering it into my ears, not me. Tarana, who was standing there desperately trying to be desensitized, but another version of me, one that was saying, tell her, she should know. Let her know what this feels like. Share yourself. Be what you said you are. And then it was just that one thing on a loop. Tell her it happened to you too. Through a lot of experiences later, even more experiences with sexual assault, she then says, so this is later in the book, she says, how different would it all be if I just had a little more courage? But what was courage, I wondered? How could I find it if I didn't know what it looked like? Maybe heaven had courage because heaven was the name of this youth that talked to her. Maybe heaven had courage because she had me. Maybe community creates courage. What if courage creates community? Maybe empathy creates courage. How can you express empathy towards others if you can't empathize with yourself? Is the core of healing, empathy, and courage. All of this was kind of the impetus of the Me Too movement that she started online. Later, though, in 2017, prominent men, including Harvey Weinstein, were accused of sexual misconduct. This led to an October 2017 tweet as follows. Actress Alyssa Milano on October 15th, 2017 posted, "If you've been sexually harassed or assaulted, write Me Too as a reply to this tweet," with this additional text, right? Suggested by a friend, if all the women who have been sexually harassed or assaulted wrote Me Too as a status, we might give people a sense of the magnitude of the problem. It's important to note that Tarana Burke was not originally associated with this post and actually woke up feeling a big sense of confusion, feeling kind of erased from the movement that she had started over 10 years prior. You can read the book to see how she kind of grapples with and engages in the movement more broadly. But just to remind you that it started earlier than just what we're going to see here. So there was a big Me Too aftermath. Individuals shared their stories, collectively joining this movement, creating almost a database of experiences of sexual assault that women and men, and all those who were willing to share, had experienced, effectively launching a transnational global discourse on sexual violence in all the ways, right? For good and for bad, as we'll talk about today. Within the first 24 hours, Me Too was tweeted over 1 million times with a very impressive staying power. In just 1 year, it was tweeted about 19 million times. So it's still happening today, right? There are still a lot of conversations around the Me Too movement. The Me Too movement was not perfect, and I'll talk about some of the complications in a second, but it did raise awareness of sexual violence through thousands of personal stories, which we know, and as Tarana Burke mentions, it creates a community, right? A sense of solidarity and empowerment that comes with sharing these stories in a platform where people are doing the same. Like I mentioned, there were complications, and we won't dive into them too much, but I think it's important to keep in mind, Me Too has been accused, or it has been said that it was not entirely inclusive of women of color and for excluding other marginalized groups, as it began with that initial tweet by Alyssa Milano, but again, kind of overlooked a little bit of Tarana Burke's initial efforts that happened here, among other kind of ways. It also prompted counter-protests such as #ProtectOurBoys and #HimToo, though none of those took the same kind of power that the Me Too movement did, which I'll come back to this later, but I think that's an important point to think about, is that the supporters and the detractors of Me Too were using the same hashtag, meaning they all had their discourse under the same umbrella, which is not true for a lot of different kind of social media debates where you have two opposing hashtags at play, which really came kind of in handy in this type of research where we could utilize one hashtag to see two opposing kind of opinions of it. The openness of Me Too has also been said that it creates potential for false accusations and threatens a system of due process, which we'll also get back to. The connection of Me Too with other kind of political events, such as the Kavanaugh Supreme Court justice confirmation hearings, linked the movement with other kind of political divisiveness, because the Kavanaugh vote confirmation fell across party lines. So it was linked to a lot of political kind of spheres which had polarizing views. A couple complications to keep in mind as we're talking about this. So Twitter. How much value do we give Twitter? I'm going to keep calling it Twitter because that is what it was called when this data took place, when we were gathering this. These are tweets, right? Other studies have used Twitter to examine political issues. This is not the first, right? They're asking questions like, how do politicians use Twitter? Who interacts with who when they're talking about political content? What kind of political content is most likely to be engaged with or retweeted? What's the purpose of certain hashtags? So there's a lot of political kind of analyses with different kind of content with Twitter. Hashtags is another big source of analysis and of the functioning of Twitter. It allows individuals to depersonalize their political and social beliefs. They can latch onto a hashtag that already has meaning behind it, and so they can kind of say, this is happening regardless, and you'll never know how I feel unless they add that. You also can transform your own opinions, the I, into a we, which also enables polarization on this issue. You can latch on with a lot of other people and find a good community there, which then supports echo chambers, where you kind of get in a hole of people either like-minded or thinking about this issue, which is important to keep in mind when thinking about these tweets that I'll share today, that they are not representative of all Republicans and Democrats and anywhere in between and beyond. It's not representative, right? It is an echo chamber of people who were tweeting about this content in a political way. There is also research that has looked at the political nature surrounding Me Too. So again, we are not the first to do that here. One such paper, one section of papers was looking at the political ideology in shaping Me Too engagement and tweet content. Something like which politicians were most likely to tweet about Me Too. Papers were looking at that. They also used Me Too to see what were people sharing when it came to sexual violence, and generally it was like the who, what, when, why, and how of their own personal stories. So we are not the first to look at Twitter data in this kind of context, but this really did shape how we were understanding and utilizing a Twitter source. One other concept that we really came across and latched onto here was the idea of linguistic hijacking. This is a form of political violence that involves strategically misusing and co-opting politically significant language in ways that harm marginalized groups. This initial term was used to explain how you utilize misinformation and ignorance and false beliefs about a phenomenon in order to alter marginalized discourse. The test kind of case for this was the terms racist and racism, trying to see how other individuals can misuse these words in order to detract the information, to confuse the definition, to get people talking about the wrong thing, right? And so we were thinking that this was maybe happening with the Me Too movement, right? That you were trying to take this initial effort to get resources into the hands of sexual assault survivors, and now the term is confused, right? We're maybe speaking to different things. So we hypothesized then that a similar process was happening with Me Too, that these words, all the words associated with Me Too, not just the hashtag, but things like victim, were being hijacked and misused strategically, right, for a reason, not just innocently, right? So our kind of hypothesis was that movement detractors have hijacked important legal and political terms such as victim to subvert the movement's overall messaging, and subsequently, though not intentionally, we would hope, redirect the political and social narratives around sexual violence. All right, when you hijack these terms and this movement that is so intertwined with sexual violence is going to inherently affect individuals' thoughts about the subject, right? So this research specifically uses Me Too tweets to understand rhetoric and narratives that both shape and reveal the polarization of sexual violence. We use a random sample of 5,153 tweets that happened or were posted between 2017 and 2019. And we are looking at the language and the themes that were utilized in these tweets to shape the conversation around the Me Too movement and around sexual violence that both aided the movement and undermined it. So we're looking at both of these kind of supporter-detractor sides. So this began as a process when I learned that we had resources to more or less scrape Twitter. And so we used a Crimson Hexagon and Twitter developer API to pull all tweets that were publicly accessible from 1 month prior to the Me Too movement, just to get a baseline of how people were using this. It was more or less like, I made cookies today, hashtag Me Too. You know, like nothing, like really inconsequential uses of the hashtag. And so when we scraped for 1 month prior and then 2 years after Alyssa Milano's tweet, that gave us roughly 24 million tweets. Due to the search monitor's limitations, we were able to scrape 72% of the tweets. So we have roughly 17.5 million of these tweets. We further limited the sample to those originating from Twitter handles in the United States, that's as concrete as we could get about the US origin, not necessarily where the tweet itself came from. And we were looking specifically at English content. So you can see there that discrepancy from 17 million down to nearly 5 million shows how global, transnational this movement was. We then took a random sample of 6,000 tweets, then removed the missing tweets, and that gave us our final sample of roughly 5,000 tweets that we were looking at here. I will say that this project began as a master's thesis for a sociology student named Hannah Schoaf. And so she was the one that undertook all of the coding here, where she was using both inductive from her own kind of read of the tweets and deductive reasoning from the literature to create a codebook. Then coded it roughly 6 times, 5,000 tweets, heavy content. She did incredible work. And then Dr. Lopez and I then took her paper and helped kind of shape it for an academic article, and then the 3 of us published that. So there's that. I'm not going to leave this here too long, but just to show you, I can send you the paper if you're curious about the details. But the numbers along the very bottom tell you the tweet numbers. So we got the tweets, the random 5,000, put them in chronological order, and so you can see the number there is the tweets that correspond to these kind of events. If you look at the 17 million, you can see big trends that happen, like the Emmys happen and it spikes, the Kavanaugh hearings happen and it spikes. So they're really tied to a lot of the political social events that are happening. So here's just some of the things going on throughout this 2-year period. Okay, so what did we find? At the broadest scope, our analysis confirms that yes, the Me Too movement in the United States was highly polarized. In these black box, you will just see random selections of tweets from our sample that are relevant for this topic. If they are like this, then we could not find these tweets anymore on X. But you'll see some that we could find, and so it's actual screenshots, and you can see who's saying these things. So how, at kind of the broadest scope, we were just looking at politics, but that's not where we spent most of our time. But before I kind of dive into our main points, this is just some of the stuff that was showing us that yes, it is political. One is that politicians and political parties were being specifically named in relation to allegations or their responses to the Me Too movement, or their lack of responses, right? Their non-engagement. And so they were naming specific politicians, for example, here. You can also see political parties mentioned specifically here, and that was very common throughout the tweets. Many of the tweets originated from sources that were connected to the news, to media organizations, celebrities, politicians, which again showed a lot of these political origins of these tweets, as they came from people connected to politics. A lot of the politicians were targets of Me Too tweets, usually in relation to their scandals or their perceived blunders regarding Me Too. And so they were being called out very often, particularly politicians. When you get into more of the detail, there were more politicians being accused in these tweets than seeing them as the help, as the ones who were going to kind of solve this problem. That was generally not the case. They were more, again, accused of misconduct rather than being seen as helpful in this scenario or being lauded for their Me Too views. So again, politicians framed as the primary source of Me Too problem rather than solution solvers. And you can see that tweet there, right? Democrats must stop saying they support women and children when they keep electing a guy who allegedly raped underage girls. Going on. Several of the anti-Democrat tweets were criticizing Democrats for weaponizing Me Too. Something like, just saw this scene from The Crucible on Tucker Carlson. Reminds me so much of the Democrat Party and the Me Too movement. This scene they're referencing is when it's kind of coming back to this due process idea that they're accusing these women of being witches or being with the devil. Again, accusations without evidence is what he was tapping into. The Democratic Party was criticized about twice as much in our sample for their Me Too-related actions compared to the Republican Party. But there were almost twice as many Republican politicians being called out compared to Democrats, very heavily dominated by Donald Trump. Politicians were directly connected to Me Too, mostly in problematic ways in our sample. Again, they were not seen as the problem solvers here. They were not being applauded for their stances in a lot of cases. More anti-Democrat tweets criticized Me Too, while almost all anti-Republican tweets were supportive of Me Too. Again, to say, this is not representative of all opinions from Republicans and conservatives and any kind of political ideology. Twitter is an echo chamber. It is a unique, already polarized place, but gives us a lot of tools to understand this rhetoric. So again, polarization of the Me Too movement and sexual violence extended beyond these political references, specifically calling out politicians and these parties, which is where we initially began this research, was just trying to see who's being talked about in these issues. But what actually became the story was the second point, that there was a lot of tools that movement supporters and detractors were using to frame their discussions around sexual violence. Not even just the Me Too movement, but around sexual violence and how we should and shouldn't be talking about it. So we're going to talk about Me Too supporters. They primarily drew on legalistic rhetoric, things like the words rights and justice, to advocate for human rights, right? To advocate for the rights of the individual who experienced this actual violence. On the other side, Me Too detractors used more legal terms such as due process and accusation in order to, and other kind of violent terms that we'll come to claim or usurp the language of violence and of victimhood in order to shift the focus to those who are being suspected of violence instead of those who are experiencing the violence. So we'll go through each of those in turn, starting with the Me Too supporters. So here's justice-focused language. So Me Too supporters were using, again, terms like justice, rights, law, equality, and accountability in order to assert the legitimacy of the claims that the individuals were putting on these Me Too posts, right, in order for recognition and support that they were seeking. They were trying to evoke the promises that law offer in terms of restitution, right, or some kind of fix for these issues. This one on the left is calling out the music arena, for example, right? The Me Too movement, this is justice. We'll get to the music one in a second. But the Me Too movement isn't trying to get significance. It's pursuing justice and cultural change. Me Too isn't attacking someone else. It's holding perpetrators accountable. Justice, again, was used by Me Too supporters to try to claim rights for the survivors, to try to have consequences for the accused, and it really was framed as this key component of the Me Too movement, according to survivors or supporters of the movement. So the essence of being an actress and a woman is being aware enough of the cruel society you're living in, using your significance, influence for peace and justice, not staying behind the shadows of your fancy, glamorous jewel image. Me Too movement is a campaign against sexual abuse. They also used rights-based language, which was fighting for human rights broadly, but also women's rights, which seemed like a natural outgrowth or next step of the Me Too movement, because they're politically aligned with a lot of the same kind of issues, right? We are stronger together in this movement for women's rights and equality. The Me Too movement demands real action from Congress to stop sexual harassment and abuse. And then they expand into rights in other arenas, right? Expanding into voting rights, civil rights, and broad kind of human and women's rights. That's why I'm co-sponsoring groundbreaking new legislation to finally end mandatory arbitration, expand civil right protections to domestic workers, interns, and contract workers, right? Linking the rights that the Me Too movement supporters are seeking, linking those to other human rights that people are similarly seeking. Law is another one. There were specific laws that came up, such as Title IX. Title IX is critical in the fight to end sexual harassment and violence on campus. It must be protected and upheld. Again, going to specific laws that can also kind of aid in reducing sexual violence in different capacities, such as sexual harassment laws advocated for on behalf of survivors. Our sample also had calls to create and change laws that would again support women in the face of sexual violence. Something like, if the Me Too conversation ends without a meaningful change in our laws, then we will have failed not only the courageous women who have come forward, but also the next generation of women who will enter the workplace. And then again, introducing other laws. So this is what Me Too supporters are thinking about. They're thinking about justice and rights, and then calling upon certain laws. They're also thinking about accountability and equality. Accountability was, again, another defining feature of the Me Too movement. Accountability is maturity. Accountability heals both the victim and the perpetrator. Nothing is going to change until it's forced to. The legendary musician opens up about her difficult journey, why music has dodged Me Too accountability, and the rise of the female rocker, trying to expand the Me Too movement into different arenas like music, politics, other kind of areas. We are voting for accountability in 2020. Again, trying to claim that survivors have the right to see legal action taken against their perpetrators. They want that accountability, and they want it in an equal fashion. Just a couple more about equality and accountability. Both men and politicians were generally called out to be held accountable here. Men who choose to sexually assault women are now being held accountable in public for their actions. Voters are transforming Me Too into Me Too voter to hold politicians accountable. So referencing these kind of broad categories. Me Too was kind of wrapped into some of the broader feminist issues that were also relevant at that time, such as equal pay, not just that time, relevant always, and the Equal Rights Amendment. Equality aligns survivors' rights with this kind of broader feminist agenda, that there's a lot of other issues to consider, and why not consider them now as well. Okay, shifting to the Me Too detractors. So again, the supporters were thinking about rights and justice, accountability, and equality. And now we'll switch to what the detractors were talking about, how we polarize sexual violence. Because remember, sexual violence is no respecter of persons, right? Everyone is equally susceptible. Well, we know there's differences, but it isn't based on politics per se. One is violent language, including words like weaponize, ruin, crucified, lynching, avenger or assassin, and mob rule. Different words associated with war and violence. These tweets would usurp or utilize violent language in support, a lot of people were using violent language, some even that supported the movement, but the detractors really dominated this section of content, trying to claim victimhood for those who were accused, which again further polarized sexual violence and the movement as a whole. They use the word weaponize often to again think about these accused as innocent men and the real victims of this Me Too movement, instead of the accusers who experienced the sexual violence. For example, it is incredibly sad for sexual assault victims that the left decided to weaponize Me Too. War on police equals Black Lives Matter. War on ICE is abolish ICE. The war on men, Me Too. What other movements will the left launch to weaponize so that they can implement mob rule? The Democrats will continue to fund anarchy in an effort to regain DC's oligarchy, which Trump disrupted. A bit more about violent language. Lynching came up quite a bit to assert that those accused of sexual violence were the victims of the violence, and there is a miscarriage of justice at play here. Lynching is a practice whereby mobs would capture individuals suspected of crime and kill them without any due process. The NAACP says that lynchings were violent public acts that white people used to terrorize and control black people in the 19th and 20th centuries, causing the death of an estimated 4,743 people. You can see these tweets here, right? Me Too is just a rebrand of Democrats using sexual assault allegations to justify the lynchings of men. Hashtag Kavanaugh hearings. Lynching was really used in relationship to the Kavanaugh Supreme Court confirmation hearings. Madness, but hey, the Me Too movement started this trend of allegations and media lynching, leading to the absurd logic of hashtag Believe All Women. The problem with the Me Too movement is that it allows anyone to make any accusation against any person from any period in time without any proof or due process, and then asks the public to act like the accusation is automatically true. This is not justice, this is lynching. The Me Too detractors also used legal terms such as due process and accusation to ground their movement or this opposition to the movement in clearly defined legal language. That is not problematic inherently. Due process is a process that reasonable people can engage with and is important. But in a lot of the tweets we noticed is that it was not being used in this way most of the time, right? It was used as a way to really pull from this movement and to really shift the attention away from sexual violence. Due process was often mentioned in reference to the Kavanaugh hearings, mentioning that he was not given the due process that he should be granted. The Me Too movement has destroyed the principle of due process. Men are not innocent until proven guilty. Men are guilty until proven innocent. And even then, many are still tarnished by false allegations lodged against them. Support men's rights. Nobody claimed our president was a rapist until he ran for office. Me Too is destroying our freedoms and rights. No due process. Mob justice. Defamation of character. Accusers proven to be lying. The force of the Me Too movement leaves no room for due process. My biggest concern with the Me Too movement is that we have overcorrected as a society, and a man is guilty until proven innocent. There's no due process or fair hearing in the court of public opinion for the accused, making it almost impossible for someone to clear their name. They also used misogynistic language to criticize feminists and the left who were engaging in Me Too support. This vocabulary they utilized was often based in political and legal and violent atrocities historically committed against women and other marginalized people, such as the Holocaust and the Salem witch trials. For example, this is tapping into misogynistic language broadly. The women behind the Me Too movement were at one time willing to trade sex for career advancement. The predatory, hateful, and politically motivated feminazis comprising the Me Too crew. Hagsplaining, when a feminist tries to explain to a rational person why it's okay if innocent men lose their jobs or otherwise suffer so a better woman can get her hashtag Me Too on. They also used witch hunt to suggest that the Me Too movement was a modern day witch hunt, which tapped into words or terms also like pitchfork and torches, witches, and hysteria to describe Me Too supporters as deranged and witch-like and violent and unstable. The soft and caring women of the hashtag Me Too movement, pitchforks and torches are optional. Expect up to 10 women to come forward in this next week with allegations about Kavanaugh. Repeat after me, this is a witch hunt. I have other tweets here and you can read them, but I just wanted to point out in these next series of tweets that Me Too supporters were not unaware of a lot of this rhetoric going on, and in some cases they responded to it. For example, why don't more women come forward about sexual assault? Women come forward about sexual assault. Media, witch hunt, fake news. That's why. So they would use this rhetoric kind of back at people, if not claiming it. Yes, this is a witch hunt. I'm a witch and I'm hunting you, right? Reclaiming that. I thought this last red one stood out to me. What is fundamentally misunderstood about by vilifiers of Me Too is that none of this is fun for us. They're picturing us holding a bag with the top tied shut, cackling away as an accused kicks and flails. In reality, every news story reopens our wounds and it hurts like hell. So what do we take of all this? Me Too supporters and detractors drew upon very specific language and narratives that further increase the polarization around sexual violence, which is the important kind of takeaway, right? It never stayed exactly with the Me Too movement because it was so intimately related with sexual violence that it's hard to pull them apart from each other. Like I mentioned, both supporters and detractors used this hashtag to assert their viewpoints on the Me Too movement, creating a solid database of these polarizing opinions in one place. To refresh, detractors employed a lot of this legal, violent, misogynistic language in order to claim victimhood for those who were accused and paint them as the real victims of the Me Too movement. And conversely, paint the accusers as the villains. They appropriated this violent language, attempting again to reframe who was subject to this violence, which we claim as a case of linguistic hijacking, as described earlier. Supporters, on the other hand, were engaging in more legalistic concepts like justice and equality in order to claim their rights in the face of violence. What's interesting is that both sides claim that they... Anyone want to go to lunch? Dismiss. Okay, claim that they care about fair legal recourse, though the lenses are different, right? The lenses of justice on one side and due process on the detractor side. The tweeting liberals and conservatives, again, to say that those who are tweeting about this, which is not everybody, but the tweeting liberals and conservatives have different visions of what to do and how to implement this type of justice or due process. It really came down to an inability to balance the rights of the accusers versus the rights of the accused. And I don't think anyone would take away that that is an issue that is still going on today, right? Is how do you navigate this in the court of law, let alone in the court of public opinion. What's important to remember, though, is that this polarization is affecting all of those who advocate for increased awareness about sexual violence, right? There's already challenges here, and we'll talk about those in a second. What's hard when you're trying to prosecute or prove instances of sexual violence is the courts rely on evidence in instances where evidence is often very hard to get. And so the often unclear definitions of sexual assault complicate prosecution. The detractors have a lot of legal language that they can latch onto. They can talk about due process, which has legal definition and legal standing. The supporters, though, don't quite have the same thing, right? They don't have these same kind of concrete terms that they can call upon, which makes it harder for them to get legal standing when it comes to supporting their movement's goals. Last kind of thing to think about, an ethic of justice, which is what the Me Too movement has really relied on, thinking about these legal terms, thinking about the justice system as the site of solving this problem of sexual violence, is somewhat masculine in nature and doesn't probably have the potential for seriously addressing women's experiences. An ethic of care, on the other hand, is more about relationships and the collective. And so if you can seek actionable steps that concerns all those who may be influenced by a situation and then acknowledges the responsibility to minimize harm, that might be a path forward, right? Trying this more collective movement opposed to going straight through this more kind of justice-focused law and crime system. So last kind of quote, many feminist scholars have urged others to seek to understand not only the perspective of those they most resemble, but also the perceptions and wishes of people with whom they might at first feel little in common, which is really surrounding the Me Too movement. People were speaking past each other in a lot of cases when I think we can all agree that sexual assault is problematic. Yet we got really distracted by this polarizing political mess. So shifting towards this ethic of care might be a piece of an antidote to these polarizing techniques utilized in the Me Too tweets, may provide some kind of tactic for policy creation and cooperation in this regard. The politicization and strategic misuse of terms like victim will continue to obscure the vulnerability of all individuals to victimhood, regardless, again, of their political ideologies, and reduce our ability to work together to address the needs of sexual assault survivors across the political spectrum. Thank you.
That was a very amazing and lighthearted way of starting our semester, wasn't it? That was amazing. I think we can all agree. This information is not just eye-opening, but hopefully it can lead us to use this frustration for action, and that we can be a little more compassionate in the way that we seek justice and in the way that we understand these issues. Not only this is an amazingly important conversation to have any time, but especially now where this political polarization is very real with election coming up, and the discourse around sexual violence and reproductive rights and reproductive safety are in the ballot. Hopefully this presentation and this information can help us, regardless of our political affiliation, that we can look at these issues with factual information, and that we can think about who these affect. Let's give another round of applause because she's amazing, right? Okay, stay curious about these issues, and we're gonna turn now to our Q&A section for a couple minutes with Christy.
Hi. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions from the audience, but I will just give my question. This movement is wildly polarized, obviously. Do you have any ideas on how we can bring people together, especially across party lines, to focus on the campaign against sexual violence instead of focusing on what polarizes it? And since the research was focused on language, maybe you have suggestions on language we can use to bring people together to help them understand the movement.
I'm happy to answer questions after, if you have questions for me. I can stand out there. But thank you for your question. I was kind of touched on that at the end, right? Thinking about what unites rather than what differs. I think it is going to require a complete shift, right? I don't think we have the groundwork right now to really think about engaging still with the Me Too movement under that umbrella. You need a lot of people to really rethink how they think about that movement, because it's become so polarized, which is really hard for Tarana Burke, who's dedicated her life to that topic, right? To then say, well, how do we get people to really think about sexual violence instead of getting just stuck on the label of the movement, which I think is what a lot of movement originators, where they find themselves, right? Just feeling frustrated about the rhetoric that gets used. But it's also gotten a conversation started. So there's pros and cons. I don't think I answered your question nearly at all, but I know time's up. So we could talk.